I had made my mother's stuffing recipe, something I hadn't cooked in years, not since the last time all of us were truly a family. It smelled of thyme and butter, that soft, golden warmth that used to mean holiday. I remember tying the foil around the dish and checking it twice. It was silly, maybe, but I even brought my own serving spoon, the one with the worn wooden handle. I didn't want to show up empty-handed. After all, I hadn't been invited. Not really. There'd been a vague mention in passing the month before, a shrug, and a maybe swing by when I asked about Thanksgiving. But I heard my own voice afterward, too cheerful, trying to smooth over what wasn't being said. I parked at the curb, their driveway was full, and sat in the car for a few moments watching the windows. I could see figures inside. Laughter, a glass raised, someone moving past with a plate. It looked warm in there, alive. I carried the dish in both hands, careful, and climbed the steps slowly. The porch light was on, but no one came to open the door, even after I rang the bell. Finally, it was my daughter-in-law, who answered, holding their dog back with one foot. "Oh, hi," she said. Her voice was tight, her smile thinner than I remembered. "I brought stuffing," I offered. "Thought I'd just stop in and—" "They're already eating," she said. "Things are a bit chaotic. The kids are wild. Maybe another time." Another time. I stood there, blinking the steam from the dish, fogging my glasses. My son didn't come to the door. I didn't hear my name called from the dining room. I didn't hear my grandchildren yell Grandma the way they used to when they were small. I just heard the dog whining behind the glass door and the sound of the television in the background. "Of course," I said after too long. I didn't even ask for the dish back. I turned and walked slowly down the steps. The cold air hit me harder than I expected. I heard the door shut behind me before I'd even reached the sidewalk. Back in the car, I sat with the keys in my lap. My hands were trembling, though I wasn't sure from what shock, maybe. Or just the sudden realization that I had become the kind of person people feel guilty about, not the kind they long to see. I drove home through quiet streets, lit with golden windows, glimpses of people around tables, clinking glasses, passing rolls. The kind of night I used to host. The kind of family I thought I had. At home, I placed the dish on the counter, still warm. I didn't even remove the foil. I didn't want to see it anymore. I sat in my armchair, the one near the window, and just stared. There was a picture of my son on the wall across from me, age 5, smiling, a cowboy hat crooked on his head. I remembered sewing that hat myself. He had wanted to be a cowboy for Halloween, and we hadn't had the money for a real costume, so I'd stayed up all night making it from scratch. He'd been so proud of it. Now I couldn't recall the last time he'd said "I love you." Maybe it was the way life shifts gradually. You don't notice the cold until your fingers are numb. You don't realize someone has let go until you look down and see you're holding nothing. I didn't cry that night, not really. But there was a kind of heaviness in my chest, like something had quietly broken and decided not to announce itself. I sat there with the stuffing untouched in the kitchen and the sound of my own breath the only thing keeping me company. It wasn't that I expected to be honored or even thanked. I know how busy people get, how families stretch and pull in different directions. But to be erased, quietly, to be written out, without anyone saying it to your face, that was its own kind of cruelty. The next day, the nurse came by, the one who helps me with my meds and groceries once a week. She knocked gently and let herself in, humming. She called out, "Hi, miss," in her usual bright voice, and then saw my face. She went quiet, just set her bag down and sat beside me on the arm of the chair, hands folded in her lap, like a child waiting for a story. I didn't say much, but she saw everything. She didn't ask right away. She just sat there with me, and in the quiet between us, something softened. I suppose I hadn't realized how tightly I'd been holding myself together. Sometimes all it takes is someone sitting beside you who isn't in a hurry, not there to fix you, just to notice. Eventually, she stood and put on a kettle of water, the way she always did. She moved around my kitchen like she belonged there, familiar with the drawer where I keep the good tea bags, the chipped mug I favored most. I could hear her humming under her breath that same tune she always came in with. It had no words, but it felt safe, like a lullaby meant for someone long grown. She brought me the tea, set it gently on the table beside me, and gave my hand the briefest squeeze. Still, no questions. But later, while she sorted my prescriptions, she finally asked, "Rough holiday?" I nodded. I didn't trust my voice yet. "I see," she said, as if I'd told her everything. Then, almost to herself, she added, "I always hated Thanksgiving. Never understood why people feel so obligated to pretend they're happy around folks who make them feel invisible." That made me smile just barely. She noticed, and her eyes lit up. "There's the face I know," she said, returning to her task. Over the next few weeks, she stayed longer after her shifts. She brought me little things, a slice of lemon pound cake, a scarf she'd found at the thrift store that she said matched my eyes, which I hadn't thought about in years. She laughed easily, without hesitation, and sometimes when we sat together, I felt something unfamiliar. Not happiness exactly, but something near it, something like ease. One day, after she'd helped me into the garden to sit by the roses, she looked at me and said, "You ever tell someone what you really need?" I blinked. "What I need?" She nodded. "Yeah, not just what you're supposed to want, not the polite version, the real kind. Like, do you need company, a place to cry? Someone to look you in the eyes and remember who you were before all this?" She gestured gently at the cane, the pills, the solitude. I looked away, embarrassed by how deeply her words landed. It's been a long time since I thought about what I need. "Well," she said, reaching over to brush a stray leaf from my lap, "maybe it's time someone asked you." That night, after she'd gone, I pulled out an old photo album, the kind with the clear plastic sheets and yellowing edges. I traced the faces with my fingers, birthdays, vacations, even a blurry shot of me in the hospital when my son was born. I'd looked tired, radiant, yes, but tired, like I'd already given something up. I thought about how hard I'd worked to raise him, alone mostly. His father was kind but distant and eventually absent. I was the one who made lunches, checked homework, stayed up worrying when he was out too late. I went without so he could go to soccer camp. I patched his jeans and his heart both more times than I could count. And now I was an inconvenience, an obligation, a background character in the life I once built around him. But the nurse, she didn't look at me like that. She asked me about books I'd read, what kind of music I liked. Before arthritis made the piano too hard. She noticed the framed embroidery by the hallway and asked if I made it myself. I had, years ago. No one else had asked. There was one day, a Tuesday, I think, when I was fussing with something in the kitchen and she stopped me mid-sentence. She looked at me with the gentlest seriousness and said, "You know you're not broken." I laughed nervously. "I'm old." "You're not broken," she said again, more firmly. "You're just in a chapter nobody teaches us how to write." That stayed with me. Long after she left that afternoon, I said it to myself once before bed. Not broken, just a chapter. It didn't fix anything, not yet, but it cracked something open. The next week she brought me a candle that smelled like cedar and cardamom. "Smells like strength and softness," she said, setting it near my window. "Like you." And for the first time in a very long while, I let myself believe her. She didn't ask right away. She just sat there with me. And in the quiet between us, something softened. I suppose I hadn't realized how tightly I'd been holding myself together. Sometimes all it takes is someone sitting beside you who isn't in a hurry, not there to fix you, just to notice. Eventually she stood and put on a kettle of water the way she always did. She moved around my kitchen like she belonged there, familiar with the drawer where I keep the good tea bags, the chipped mug I favored most. I could hear her humming under her breath that same tune she always came in with. It had no words, but it felt safe, like a lullaby meant for someone long grown. She brought me the tea, set it gently on the table beside me, and gave my hand the briefest squeeze. Still no questions. But later, while she sorted my prescriptions, she finally asked, "Rough holiday?" I nodded. I didn't trust my voice yet. "I see," she said, as if I'd told her everything. Then almost to herself she added, "I always hated Thanksgiving. Never understood why people feel so obligated to pretend they're happy around folks who make them feel invisible." That made me smile just barely. She noticed and her eyes lit up. "There's the face I know," she said, returning to her task. Over the next few weeks, she stayed longer after her shifts. She brought me little things, a slice of lemon, pound cake, a scarf she'd found at the thrift store that she said matched my eyes, which I hadn't thought about in years. She laughed easily, without hesitation, and sometimes when we sat together, I felt something unfamiliar. Not happiness exactly, but something near it, something like ease. One day, after she'd helped me into the garden to sit by the roses, she looked at me and said, "You ever tell someone what you really need?" I blinked. "What I need?" She nodded. "Yeah. Not just what you're supposed to want, not the polite version, the real kind. Like, do you need company A place to cry? Someone to look you in the eyes and remember who you were before all this?" She gestured gently at the cane, the pills, the solitude. I looked away, embarrassed by how deeply her words landed. It's been a long time since I thought about what I need. "Well," she said, reaching over to brush a stray leaf from my lap, "maybe it's time someone asked you." That night after she'd gone, I pulled out an old photo album, the kind with the clear plastic sheets and yellowing edges. I traced the faces with my fingers, birthdays, vacations, even a blurry shot of me in the hospital when my son was born. I'd looked tired, radiant, yes, but tired, like I'd already given something up. I thought about how hard I'd worked to raise him, alone mostly. His father was kind but distant and eventually absent. I was the one who made lunches, checked homework, stayed up worrying when he was out too late. I went without so he could go to soccer camp. I patched his jeans and his heart both more times than I could count. And now I was an inconvenience, an obligation, a background character in the life I once built around him. But the nurse, she didn't look at me like that. She asked me about books I'd read, what kind of music I liked before arthritis made the piano too hard. She noticed the framed embroidery by the hallway and asked if I made it myself. I had, years ago. No one else had asked. There was one day, a Tuesday I think, when I was fussing with something in the kitchen, and she stopped me mid-sentence. She looked at me with the gentlest seriousness and said, "You know you're not broken." I laughed nervously. "I'm old." "You're not broken," she said again more firmly. "You're just in a chapter nobody teaches us how to write." That stayed with me, long after she left that afternoon. I said it to myself once before bed. Not broken, just a chapter. It didn't fix anything, not yet, but it cracked something open. The next week, she brought me a candle that smelled like cedar and cardamom. "Smells like strength and softness," she said, setting it near my window. "Like you." And for the first time in a very long while, I let myself believe her. The next morning, I woke to silence. Not the kind that hurts, not that empty, hollow silence I'd grown used to, but the kind that feels like a held breath, a moment before something begins. I moved through my house slowly as I often do, letting my hand trail along the furniture I've had for decades. The oak dining table with the faint ring from a Thanksgiving cider spill, the corner shelf where I used to display finger-painted gifts, my fingers curled around the edge of the doorway, the same one my son used to run under in socks too big for his feet, giggling, flying. Each room was like a museum of ghosts, not haunted but full of echoes. In the living room, I sat on the floral couch that had long since faded from sunlight and memory. I stared at the fireplace. Cold, clean, unused. Once there'd been stockings there, his and mine, and even one for the dog. It's funny how no one tells you that the grief of aging isn't just about losing people to death. It's about watching the living slowly forget your place in their story. I opened the closet near the hallway, the one I hadn't looked in for a while, and stared at the rows of coats. His tiny jacket still hung there, from when he was 6, a brown corduroy thing I couldn't bring myself to throw away. I ran my fingers over it, then pulled down an old box tucked high on the shelf. Inside were birthday cards, report cards, one yellowed drawing labeled me and Mom at the beach. I sat on the floor, the box beside me, and held those pieces of paper like they were treasure, because they were. One photo slipped out a candid I'd forgotten, me and my son at the county fair years ago. He was grinning, his hand sticky with cotton candy, and I was laughing, young, sunlit, proud. My throat tightened. I wanted to go back to that moment and whisper to that woman, "He will forget you one day, not all at once, but slowly, and it will ache more than anything else you've survived." But I didn't weep, not then. I just closed the box and stood. I wandered back into the kitchen, boiled water for tea, and sat in the window seat. Across the street, a family was decorating their porch. A little girl ran in circles while her father adjusted a wreath. They looked so ordinary, so untouched by the kind of grief that doesn't make headlines, the grief of being left behind by the very person you once fed with a spoon and taught to tie his shoes. When the nurse arrived later that afternoon, I was still in the window. She brought groceries and small talk, but when she saw my face, she paused. "Do you ever feel like you're living in a house made of memories?" I asked. She didn't answer right away. She walked over, looked around, and then said softly, "Sometimes memories are stronger than walls." We didn't speak much more after that. She just stayed folding laundry with me, asking about the story behind each knick-knack. She made a game of it. "Tell me the tale of this teapot," she'd say, and I'd find myself smiling at a memory I hadn't touched in years. Later that night, after she'd gone, I walked through the house again. But this time I wasn't looking at what was gone. I was noticing what still remained. The things I had built, the history in my own hands. In my bedroom, I sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the framed photo of my son's graduation. He looked proud. So did I. I traced our faces with my eyes and asked myself quietly, when did he begin to pull away? There was no clear moment, just a series of tiny ones, the missed calls, the holidays abbreviated, the sense that I was only welcome when I was needed, and even then reluctantly. But here's the strange part. When I closed my eyes, I didn't see him anymore. I saw her, the nurse, her hands folding my sweaters without being asked, her voice reminding me that I wasn't broken. And I realized something simple and sad and quietly beautiful. Maybe love doesn't always come from the places we expect. Maybe family isn't who shares your blood. Maybe, just maybe, family is who stays. She came in the next morning with her usual light step, her bag slung across one shoulder, and a little box in her hand. "You like scones?" she asked. The bakery had cranberry orange today. Smelled too good not to bring one. I nodded, smiling more easily than I had in days. We sat across from each other at the kitchen table. She poured tea without asking, like it had become our ritual, and it had. It was a quiet morning, the kind where the sky outside looked like it was holding its breath. I sipped slowly, watching her stir honey into her cup. I don't remember what prompted it exactly, maybe the stillness, maybe the way she kept looking at me like I wasn't invisible, but I finally spoke. "Do you want to know what happened?" She didn't rush to answer, just looked up and nodded once. So I told her. I told her about how things used to be, how my son and I had always been close, or so I thought. How I was there for every little thing, every flu, every field trip, every heartbreak. How I'd fought for scholarships, driven hours to visit during college, loaned money when he and his wife bought their first home. How I had let the lines between help and sacrifice blur again and again, because that's what mothers do. And then how things had changed so gradually I hadn't even noticed. At first it was subtle, shorter phone calls, longer silences, visits that felt more like obligations than reunions. And then came the small dismissals. "We'll let you know, don't worry about it. It's just easier this way." One by one, those phrases stacked themselves like bricks between us. But I didn't say anything, I whispered. I didn't want to seem needy. I didn't want to be the kind of mother who guilt trips her children. So I stayed quiet. I thought maybe I was just imagining it. I paused, unsure whether to keep going. She reached across the table and touched my hand lightly just once, and that was all the permission I needed. I told her about the lake house, how I had bought it after my husband died, imagining long weekends with the grandkids, canoe rides, marshmallows, the works. I paid for the whole thing in cash from the life insurance. Gave them the keys, said it was for us. But I started to notice how I was never invited anymore, how they hosted other family, friends, neighbors, but not me. The last time I tried to go up there, the locks had been changed. My son hadn't even mentioned it. "I just assumed," he said later. "You don't get around well. Figured you wouldn't use it." He figured, I repeated softly to her now, staring down at the tea leaves at the bottom of my cup, like I was a package left on a porch, just something to be figured into a plan or out of it. She didn't speak for a while, just let the silence settle. Then she said, "People talk about aging like it's only physical, but this kind of loss, the kind where people keep living while slowly stepping away from you, it's a different kind of pain." I swallowed hard. I kept hoping he'd notice, that he'd see I was fading from his life and reach out, say something, anything. But all I got were polite smiles and careful avoidance. We sat there for a long time, the afternoon light, crawling across the floor, the scone long forgotten. Finally she spoke again. "You know what I see when I look at you." I raised my eyebrows, wary of the answer. "I see a woman who gave everything, not just out of duty, but out of love. And you still have more to give, but maybe not to the people who turned away. Maybe it's time to start choosing who deserves your heart." Her words hit me like warm water in a cold room, sudden and soft and deeply needed. That evening I found myself opening drawers. I pulled out letters, old photos, receipts, and journals, not to wallow, but to gather, to remember that I had lived, that I was not just someone's mother, not just an old woman with too many pill bottles and not enough visitors. I was someone who had danced in bare feet on linoleum floors, who had carried a child on her hip while balancing bills, in the other hand, who had made something a home, a life, a legacy. And perhaps, just perhaps, I could still make something more. It was a Thursday afternoon when I heard the voice on speakerphone. My son was talking to someone while I sat nearby knitting quietly in the corner. He must have assumed I couldn't hear, or maybe he forgot I was even there. That forgetting I was learning was its own kind of violence. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, But when your name floats into the air like a gust through a cracked window, you pay attention. Well, the lake house was always going to be mine, he said. His voice sounded calm, certain. She just made it official. I mean, come on. I basically paid for all the upkeep. He laughed as if remembering something amusing. She didn't even know how to set the thermostat. My hand stilled in my lap. The yarn sagged between my fingers like something deflated. I had paid every cent for that house, every wall, every window. I had spent my grief money, my husband's legacy, not to escape pain, but to transform it. I bought that house because I dreamed of giving my family a place where joy could live longer than sorrow. And yet there he was, erasing it with one sentence, making it sound like he'd earned it, like I had been a generous bystander instead of the architect. I should have been furious. I should have stormed into the room and demanded recognition, but what I felt was quieter, heavier, like watching a painting you'd worked on for years get washed away in the rain. I left the room without a word. I went into the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and stared out the window at the garden, overgrown now, but still beautiful. The hydrangeas had started to bloom again. They didn't ask for attention. They just came back. When the nurse arrived later, I didn't tell her what I'd heard, but she must have seen it in my eyes. She sat me down with warm hands and asked if I was ready for a walk. We walked slowly, my arm linked through hers down the sidewalk and into the park. Children were playing ducks gliding along the pond, teenagers scrolling through phones on benches. The world was still spinning, even if mine felt like it had stalled. At one point she asked, did something happen? I hesitated, then nodded. I just realized something. What's that? That he's already let me go. A long time ago. He's just been too polite to say it. We walked in silence for a while after that. It wasn't heavy, it was accepted. Later that evening, back in the house, I stood in the hallway and looked at the photos again, the ones that lined the walls. My son's face at every age, his first steps, his first car, his wedding. I reached for one in particular, a framed shot of all of us at the lake house on the day I signed the deed over. I was holding the pen, smiling. He was beside me, arm around my shoulder. His wife was already looking at the backyard, calculating. I took the photo down and turned it over. I had written something on the back in cursive years ago. A place where we will always belong. That was the lie I had told myself. I placed the photo in a drawer, not out of bitterness, but because I was done holding on to stories that no longer wanted me in them. The nurse stayed late that night. She made soup, hummed softly, and read to me from a novel she liked, something about resilience, about a woman who left her old life and found her own strength. At one point, I looked over and studied her face. Noticed the way she leaned into the words, how she paused at the emotional parts, how she looked up to see if I was still with her. And it struck me this woman who had no reason to care about me beyond a paycheck had become my shelter. I wondered what it would mean to let someone like that in, not just into my home, but into the hollows I didn't speak of. I didn't say anything aloud that night. But as I lay in bed, the ceiling dim above me, I felt something shift, the quiet, powerful kind of shift that doesn't come with thunder or flash, but with the stillness that says enough. Enough erasing, enough silence, enough waiting to be claimed. I was done being quietly discarded, and I was just beginning to imagine what it might mean to choose someone back. It was a Sunday evening when I got the call. Not from my son, I'd long since stopped expecting that. It was his wife, her voice thin, with false cheer, like plastic wrap stretched too tight. "We're having a little dinner tonight," she said. "Just family. If you want to come by, maybe around 6. It was already 5:30. Still I went. I don't know why, really. Maybe because some part of me still believed in the crumbs they offered. Maybe because at the time I hadn't yet learned that crumbs only taste like love when you're starving for it. I dressed quickly, a soft blouse I'd saved for nice occasions, and a brooch my mother had given me decades ago. I even curled my hair slightly and dabbed on lipstick. I looked in the mirror and whispered, "You're still here," before heading out the door. When I arrived, their front porch was cluttered with shoes. I could hear voices and laughter from inside. It was bright crowded. I paused for a moment before knocking. My son opened the door. He didn't smile right away. "Oh, hey, you made it," he said as if surprised. He glanced over his shoulder. "We're kind of short on chairs, but we'll find you a spot." I stepped inside. The smell of garlic and wine hung in the air. The children were running around. Dishes clattered in the kitchen. His wife handed me a dish towel. "Could you help set the table? We're behind." I nodded. Of course I nodded. That's what I always did. I became useful. Not wanted, just useful. There was no "happy you're here." No "we missed you." No seat waiting with my name. I laid out the paper napkins and mismatched silverware counting places. 11. But none had a space card with Mom or Grandma. When we sat down, I was tucked at the very end of the table, beside the high chair and a stack of unopened mail. The conversation swirled above my head. Vacation plans, new phones, a neighbor's renovation. I tried to join in once, asked about how one of the children was liking school. "Oh, we've got it handled," my daughter-in-law said lightly with a smile that never reached her eyes. At some point I realized no one had asked me how I was. Not once. After dinner I cleared plates automatically. Old habits. I carried them into the kitchen and started washing my hands, moving like they remembered who I used to be. Behind me I heard my son say to his wife, "I'm glad she came, but let's not make this a regular thing. She gets overwhelmed." Gets overwhelmed. I felt a rush of heat in my chest, but I didn't turn around. I just kept scrubbing. I thought about the nurse, how she always asked me what I liked, how she waited for my answers, how she never once made me feel like a burden. When the dishes were done, I said my goodbyes. No one walked me to the door. I closed it softly behind me and walked back to my car alone. At home, I didn't cry, not in the way I used to. I sat at my table, poured myself a small glass of wine, and lit the candle she'd given me cedar and cardamom strength and softness. And then I picked up my phone. I texted the nurse, "Would you like to come for dinner next Sunday, just us?" She replied within 2 minutes, "I'd love that. What should I bring?" I stared at her message and smiled, not because she was coming, but because she asked what she could bring. Not what she could take, not what she could expect. That was the beginning of the shift, not a storm, not a confrontation, just a dinner invite and the courage to say, "I choose who enters my home now. I choose who sits at my table." She arrived 10 minutes early, holding a small glass vase with fresh eucalyptus and lavender tied in twine. "I didn't know what kind of flowers you like," she said, "but these felt like calm." Her voice was light, but her eyes searched mine, not for flaws or signs of decline, but for me, the real me. I welcomed her inside, already barefoot in my kitchen apron, hands lightly floured from shaping the pie crust. I hadn't cooked like this in years, not because I couldn't, but because I hadn't had a reason to. That night I did. I had set the table for 2, my best dishes, polished silver cloth napkins folded in the shape of tulips, something I remembered learning back when setting a table was an art, not an afterthought. "Is this too much?" I asked, suddenly unsure. She looked around the low candlelight, the soft piano music playing in the background, the scent of herbs in the oven. "No," she said simply. "It's beautiful. You're allowed to be celebrated. We talked over roasted chicken and warm rolls, a small salad with shaved parmesan, and the lemon pie I'd nearly burned but rescued in time. We didn't talk about pain, not directly, but everything we said was stitched with understanding. She told me about growing up in foster care, how she learned early to listen more than speak, how she used to imagine the kind of home she might one day create, even if no one created one for her. I told her about teaching my son to read, about the nights I stayed up sewing costumes, ironing school uniforms, calling the insurance company when he crashed his first car, the endless, invisible labors of love. And now he treats you like a hired memory, she said softly, not cruelly, just honestly. I didn't answer. I didn't have to. Later, we sat in the living room, tea warming our hands. She asked to see my embroidery, so I brought out the old chest. I watched her marvel at the tiny stitches, the faded threads shaped like birds and vines, and words that once mattered. You have such a patient hand, she said. It's like your heart moved through the needle. No one had ever said that to me before. We sat like that for hours, two women from very different beginnings meeting in the same quiet middle. Not mother and daughter by blood, but something else, something just as strong, if not stronger. When she left that night, she hugged me. Not the polite kind of hug, the kind where someone rests their cheek on your shoulder and breathes like they've found home. I stood in the doorway after she drove off, watching her taillights fade, and whispered, "Come back whenever you like." And she did. Every Sunday after that. Some weeks she brought groceries, sometimes just herself. We made stews and soup and talked about things that had no name, the kind of sadness that lives between ribs, the joy of small kindnesses, the ache of being needed, and then not. I found myself humming more, moving easier. I wore my nice clothes again, not for show, but because I wanted to feel like someone whose presence was worth noticing. I began to ask her questions about her dreams, her favorite books, the kind of place she'd like to live in one day. She told me once I never really saw myself as anyone's daughter, but you make me feel like maybe I could be. It hit me with such quiet force that I had to sit down, because I'd been waiting for so long to be chosen again. And here was someone choosing me in the gentlest, most consistent ways. Not out of duty, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. It was then that I began to wonder, not with desperation, but with a calm clarity. What if I got to choose too? What if I could rewrite the story everyone assumed had ended? What if blood wasn't the only path to family? The thought didn't frighten me. It thrilled me. I was reorganizing the hall closet when I saw it again, the box labeled joint account. In my handwriting, faded but legible. I pulled it down more out of instinct than intention. Dust clouded the air as I opened the lid, revealing years of bank statements, notarized forms, and those little duplicate checkbooks we used to balance every Sunday night. He used to sit beside me at the table, pretending to be bored, while I tried to teach him how to manage money. It's not just numbers, I used to say. It's responsibility. It's trust. He always nodded eyes elsewhere. I flipped through the paperwork now with a slow, methodical hand. The names on the accounts brought a mix of warmth and ache. Mrs. Eleanor Harper and Mr. David Harper, joint tenants. After my husband passed, I added my son. It seemed natural at the time, seamless even. I was thinking of the future, of making things easier. But as I scanned more recent documents, a strange heaviness settled over me. The line where my name should have been was missing. Instead, there it was, David Harper and Laura Harper, his wife. I stared at the page for what felt like hours. There was no signature from me, no call, no letter, no request, just removal. I stood very still. The The paper in my hand trembled slightly, but my heart did not. Not anymore. He had erased me quietly. Financially, I was fine. This wasn't about the money. It was about the symbolism, the assumption that I no longer had a place, the quiet reallocation of my presence. When the nurse arrived that afternoon, she found me sitting at the kitchen table, the papers spread out before me like puzzle pieces of a life someone else had rearranged. "Do you need help with something?" she asked gently. I looked up and said, "I think I've been evicted from my own legacy." She tilted her head. "Do you want to talk about it?" I did. I told her everything, the joint accounts, the gradual replacement, the silence. And she listened with the kind of stillness that makes room for grief. No gasps, no judgment, just a quiet respect for the wound. When I finished, she looked at me with such steady compassion that I felt like the floor had returned beneath my feet. "You're not alone," she said. "And this," she gestured to the mess of paper, "this doesn't define you." "I know," I whispered, "but it reveals something I've been trying not to see." She nodded. "What does it reveal?" "That they've already divided the life I built as if I'm already gone." We sat in that truth together, no rushing to fix it, no platitudes, just shared breath and understanding. That evening, I pulled out a different box, one I hadn't opened since the lawyer's card slid into my mailbox the year after my husband died. I'd saved it. For someday, I told myself, just in case. Now felt like someday. I called the number. The voice on the other end was older now, but warm. I made an appointment. Nothing urgent, I said. Just updating my documents. When I hung up, the nurse was still there washing dishes without being asked. I walked over and said softly, "Would you come with me next week to the lawyer's office?" She looked surprised, but not unsure. "Of course," she said. "Anything you need." That night I slept well, not because everything was fixed, but because I'd made a decision. I wasn't going to wait for them to honor me. I wasn't going to hope they remembered. I was going to write myself back into the story, and I was going to decide with a clear and open heart who would be part of the next chapter. I hadn't meant to open that closet. I was reaching for a spare blanket. The air had turned cool that morning, and instead my hand landed on something stiff, tucked behind an old shoebox. I pulled it out, confused at first by the rough edge of fabric against my fingers. It was the quilt, the one I had made for my son's wedding. I unfolded it slowly in the hallway light. The stitches still firm, the colors a little faded. I had spent weeks on it, deep navy for steadiness, forest green for growth, soft cream for comfort. I'd sewn their initials into one corner along with the words, "For all the winters ahead." He never mentioned it after I gave it to him. I assumed they'd tucked it into a hope chest, or maybe used it during those early newlywed months when life is still tender. But here it was, folded and forgotten behind board games. No one played anymore. Not even kept, just discarded. I sat down with it in my lap, fingers moving across the seams like a mother's hand across a fevered brow. I remembered how I'd chosen every fabric with intention, how I'd pricked my thumb twice and didn't stop, how I'd wrapped it in white paper and tied it with ribbon the morning of the ceremony, heart full to bursting with pride and hope. And now it meant nothing to them, but it still meant something to me. The nurse arrived not long after. She saw me sitting there, quilt spilling over my knees, and didn't ask a thing. She knelt beside me and ran her fingers over the embroidery. "This is beautiful," she said. "You made it." I nodded. My throat felt tight. "For my son," I whispered. "For his home." She took a long breath. "Well, I think maybe it found its way back to where it belongs." We didn't move for a long while. She sat on the floor beside me, her shoulder touching mine. The quilt between us like a bridge, from the woman I was to the woman I was becoming. Later, as we folded it together, she said, "You know not everyone gets the kind of love you put into this. Most people wouldn't even know where to begin." I looked at her, and for a brief aching second, I wanted to tell her everything about the birthdays missed, the phone calls never returned, the ways I had quietly shrunk myself to fit into the space they allowed. But I didn't need to. She saw it. She always saw it. I put the quilt on my own bed that night, not out of bitterness, but because it was mine, my work, my care, my story. And I slept better beneath it than I had in years. The next morning I laid out my will, the old one, neatly typed, notarized, sealed, my son's name on every page. Then beside it I opened a fresh document, blank, white, full of possibility. I began listing what mattered, not assets but intentions. Who had shown up? Who had asked how I felt? Who had noticed when I was in pain and stayed? I didn't write her name just yet, but I felt it there pressing gently on my heart like sunlight warming frost. She hadn't asked for anything. She never hinted, never angled. But if family is built on care, on presence, on seeing someone when the world walks past them like a shadow, then she had earned something more permanent than blood. She had earned belonging, and I was beginning to believe that I had earned the right to give it. The lawyer's office was quiet, tucked into an old brick building that smelled faintly of books and carpet cleaner. We climbed the narrow stairs slowly. My arm looped through hers, her pace matched to mine. She didn't rush me, not once. The receptionist greeted us with a small smile, and I could feel the nurse's hand gently steady my elbow as I signed in. It wasn't nerves exactly. I'd been here before, after all. But today felt different. The lawyer, Mr. Halbert, had been handling my affairs since my husband passed. He was older now, grayer, his glasses perched lower on his nose. He looked up from his desk and smiled when he saw me. "Eleanor," he said warmly, "it's good to see you. And this must be—" "My nurse," I said, hesitating just a second too long. "A dear friend." She smiled politely but said nothing. She knew this was my space to speak. We sat, and I handed him the manila folder I'd brought. Inside the outdated will, a typed list of changes, and a handwritten note, more for myself than him, that read, "This time, make sure the love goes where it lives." He read through the list in silence, his brows lifting slightly, then nodded. "All right," he said quietly. "Would you like to talk through these decisions?" "No," I said. "I've already done the talking, years of it. Now it's time to be heard." He looked me in the eye, then nodded again. Understood. We spent the next hour finalizing details. The accounts, the property, the lake house still legally mine, though I'd stepped away from it long ago. I had it marked to be sold, the proceeds redirected. My son's name appeared only once, beside a single note. One family photo album. Let him remember what he lost. But her name, the nurse, my steady visitor, my quiet witness, appeared on nearly every page. I left her not only what I owned, but what I valued, the garden I loved, the letters I wrote, but never sent the recipe book full of margin notes, the house that still smelled of lavender and cinnamon, the things that held me together. She never asked for any of it. That's what made her worthy. When we were done, the lawyer asked gently, "Would you like a moment alone before you sign?" I shook my head. "No, I've been alone enough." And so with her sitting silently beside me, I signed my name, firm, slow, with purpose. As we left, I noticed her wiping at her cheek. She wasn't crying, not exactly, but something had shifted. Outside, the sky had darkened, rain threatening in the distance. We stood under the awning and I turned to her. "I don't know what this all feels like to you," I said. "I don't want you to think I expect anything." She looked at me, her face open in that rare, beautiful way people only show when they know they are loved. "I don't feel like I was given something," she said softly. "I feel like I was trusted. That's bigger." And it was. That night back home, I pulled out a photo of my mother taken long ago in her garden apron, tied at the waist, hands full of tomatoes. She had been kind, quiet, but strong in ways no one ever credited. I tucked the photo into the back of my new will, because this story didn't start with me, but maybe it would end with me choosing something better. Not inheritance, not revenge. Just the gentle, defiant act of redirecting love where it had actually lived. It was mid-December when I finally stopped sending the gifts. For years, even as the distance between us grew colder, I had continued the rituals, wrapping paper carefully chosen bows tied with a soft tug, name tags written in my best cursive. Sweaters, books, toys I imagined the grandchildren might like. And for my son, always something thoughtful, a special blend of coffee, a photo frame once, even a wool coat he never acknowledged. Each package sent with hope that maybe this year something would thaw. But not this year. I stood in the hallway, the box half-filled tissue paper rustling like old wings, and I realized not once had they thanked me. Not once had they asked how I was spending Christmas. Not once had they invited me to be there. I closed the box slowly, sat beside it on the floor. The air felt still, as if waiting for me to catch up to a truth I had been circling for too long. I didn't owe them these gifts. Love, when returned with indifference or dismissal, becomes something else. It becomes sacrifice, and eventually self-erasure. I carried the box back into the living room and set it on the shelf. Not out of anger, just release. The nurse arrived later that afternoon with a tin of spiced cookies and a scarf she'd knit in soft, gray wool. "I wasn't sure if you celebrated," she said with a shy smile, "but I thought you might like this anyway." I held the scarf to my cheek and nodded. "I do. But maybe it's time I celebrate differently." She helped me put up a small tree when I hadn't unpacked in years. We decorated it slowly, gently. Every ornament had a story, and I told her each one. The glass dove I bought after my mother died, the ceramic angel missing one wing, painted by a toddler who once called me Mommy with complete faith, the crocheted stars made by hands that had long since stilled. When we finished, we sat in the glow of the tiny lights, 2 mugs of cider warming our hands, silence between us, thick with something rich and kind. "I didn't send them anything this year," I said quietly. She didn't ask who. She already knew. "And how do you feel?" she asked. I thought for a moment. Lighter, not sad, just like I finally stopped knocking on a door that never opened. We made a new tradition that night. We watched an old movie, shared buttered toast and marmalade, and read aloud from a book of poetry I hadn't touched in decades. She stayed late, so late, in fact, that I finally said, "Why don't you stay over? There's a guest room. I'd feel better knowing someone was here." She hesitated just a moment, then smiled, "Only if I can help with breakfast." We laughed. And in that laughter, I felt something shift, again softer this time, but deeper. Not a break, not a revelation, just a subtle turning, like winter sunlight through a window landing quietly on the floor. When I went to bed, I stood for a moment outside the guest room door, listening to her move about. She was humming that same melody, wordless and gentle. And I thought maybe this is what it means to begin again. Not to replace what was lost, but to honor what remains and build something warm around it. Christmas morning used to be chaos. Wrapping paper everywhere, hot chocolate spilling on the rug, laughter echoing off the walls. I used to wake early, tie on my robe, and sit with a cup of coffee just to feel the quiet before the storm of joy. But this year the house was still, peacefully so. No children yelling down the hallway, no car engine in the driveway, no waiting for the sound of a knock that never came. I made myself oatmeal, cinnamon nutmeg, a splash of milk. I set the table for two out of habit, then smiled when I realized it wasn't habit at all anymore. She came down the hallway, slowly rubbing sleep from her eyes' hair in a loose braid. She looked around and said, "You know, I never had a Christmas morning like this, not one that felt safe." "Well, I said you do now." We opened our small gifts in the living room, the fireplace screen glowing with a modest fire she had built with kindling from the garage. I gave her a pair of leather gloves, practical warm. She gave me a notebook bound in soft red linen. "It's for you to start again," she said, her voice a bit shy. "Write things for yourself this time, not for anyone else." I ran my hand over the cover. It felt like possibility. Later, we made breakfast together. Eggs, toast, jam, from the little market downtown. The music played softly in the background, something jazzy and old. We moved easily around each other, a rhythm already forming. I didn't miss the noise. I didn't miss the old chaos. I missed the version of it I had once believed was real, before the silence crept in, before the love became lopsided. But now, I had something else, something real. That afternoon, we bundled up and took a walk through the neighborhood. Wreaths hung on every door, windows glowing with candles and string lights. Children waved from porches, neighbors nodded politely, and the cold air made our cheeks bloom pink. We stopped near the small church on the corner, the one with the bell tower that hadn't rung in years. She looked up and said, "You ever think about ringing it yourself just to see what happens?" I laughed. I don't think they'd appreciate the scandal of an old woman sneaking into the bell tower on Christmas Day. But what a headline it would be, she smiled. "Woman finds voice and lets it ring." We stood there for a moment longer, and then she reached for my hand, just held it. No fanfare, no comment, like it was the most natural thing in the world. And maybe it was. That night, as the world grew quiet again, we sat by the fire and talked about nothing and everything, how she used to climb trees to get away from the noise in her old foster home, how I used to read poetry under the table during dinner to escape my father's silence. We were two women with different wounds, but somehow in each other's presence, they didn't feel like wounds anymore. They felt like roots. Before bed, she looked at me and said, "This was the best Christmas I've ever had." I nodded, swallowing the warmth in my throat, mine too. And it wasn't the food, or the gifts, or the decorations. It was the stillness, the kindness, the mutual choosing. I lay in bed that night, the quilt pulled up to my chin, and whispered into the dark. I gave everything I had to people who stopped seeing me, and now I've given nothing to someone who sees me completely. And somehow, that is everything. I waited. Not with hope, not this time, but with a kind of quiet curiosity. I wanted to see if absence could speak louder than presence, if silence when earned could echo. New Year's came and went, then Valentine's Day. The days blurred together, gently stitched by routine and companionship. My nurse, my friend, stayed often now. Not every night, but often enough that her toothbrush lived in the bathroom drawer, and her coat hung beside mine. One morning in early spring, I was trimming the hydrangeas out front when the mail arrived. A small stack utilities catalogs, a birthday coupon for a store I no longer visited, and one envelope with my son's handwriting on it. I stared at it for a long time. It wasn't thick, no apology ever is. I opened it slowly, more out of ceremony than anticipation. Inside a folded note. Heard from a neighbor you weren't at the lake house anymore. Hope you're doing okay. Let us know if you need anything. That was all. No, Mom. No, I've been thinking about you. Just a placeholder of concern, barely warm, scribbled like a business note passed across a table. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. That weekend, I baked a loaf of rosemary bread, the old recipe my mother taught me when I was 12. My friend was painting in the garden, her sleeves rolled up, sunlight resting in her hair like a halo. I brought the bread out to her on a cutting board, 2 cups of tea in hand. She looked up and grinned. You keep this up, and I'll never leave. You say that like it's a threat, I teased. We laughed, and she pulled out a chair beside her for me. Got a letter, I said once we'd settled in. She glanced at me, waiting. From my son. Her expression didn't shift, just waited the way she always did, with space instead of pressure. Nothing in it, I said. Words but no meaning. No weight. It felt like someone asking after a stranger they once passed on the street. She reached for my hand and squeezed gently. You don't have to keep holding out your heart to someone who doesn't notice when they drop it. We sat in silence after that, the kind that didn't need to be filled. Later that evening, I lit a fire and placed the letter into the flames. It curled, smoked, and disappeared. No ceremony, no grief. Just ash. I realized as the paper blackened and vanished that I didn't miss him anymore. I missed who he used to be. But that version of him, that boy who once held my hand, crossing the street, who once fell asleep against my shoulder in the back seat after school, he was long gone. And I had mourned him already. Now I was choosing something else. Not bitterness, not rage. Just peace. I turned to her as she passed behind me with a folded blanket. You've been more of a child to me than he's been in years, I said. She paused, 1 foot on the stair, and looked at me, really looked. I feel more like your daughter than anyone I've ever known, she said quietly. And neither of us said anything more, because there was nothing else that needed to be said. It happened on a morning so gentle, so plain, that it almost felt like fate chose that quiet moment just to make sure I could hear myself think. We were having breakfast, nothing special, just soft scrambled eggs, toast with fig jam, and the last of the early strawberries in a chipped ceramic bowl. She was reading aloud from the paper some silly headline about a squirrel invasion in a nearby park, and I was laughing more than I should have been. But it felt good. It felt like laughter was something I didn't have to ration anymore. Then she said it almost absently, her eyes still scanning the print. You know, sometimes I wonder what it would have felt like to grow up with a mother like you. My heart stopped for just a moment. I put down my fork. You didn't, I asked gently. Have someone like that? She looked up. Her face didn't crumple. It didn't even harden. She just shook her head slowly. There were women who were supposed to be, she said. Foster moms, case workers, the kind who give you meals and rules and clean sheets, but not the kind who stay up when you're sick or remember the way you like your toast. She smiled, and it broke me in the softest way. You make breakfast like it means something, she said. And in that moment, the words came before I could doubt them. Would you ever want to be mine? She froze, her lips, parting eyes wide. What do you mean? I reached across the table, taking her hand in both of mine. I mean legally, officially, if you wanted. I asked the lawyer. There's nothing stopping me from adopting you. Not at my age, not at yours. There's no clock on love. There's no limit. Her eyes welled, but she didn't let the tears fall. She covered her mouth with her hand, then laughed this sharp, overwhelmed laugh that turned into a sob halfway through. You would really Want me, she whispered. I already do, I said. I've already chosen you day after day. This would just make it true on paper. But I want it to be true in every way. She stood from her chair, moved around the table, and folded herself into my arms, not carefully, not delicately. She collapsed into me like someone who'd been holding her breath for years. I never thought anyone would pick me, she said. Not first, not ever. You're not second, I whispered. You are my beginning again. The paperwork didn't take long. Mr. Halberd was cautious but kind. It's unusual, he said, but not unheard of. I'm not interested in usual, I told him. We signed the documents in his office, just the three of us. She wore a pale blue sweater and trembling hands. I wore my mother's pin, the one with the small gold birds in flight. It felt right. When it was done, and the pen was set down, she turned to me and said, I never had a name that felt like it meant anything. But yours, it feels like shelter. I don't need anyone else to approve, I told her. I've already lived long enough to know the difference between obligation and love. That evening we made tea and sat outside, the stars beginning to gather above our heads. I looked over at her, my daughter now, and felt the strangest peace settle in my chest, the kind that doesn't come often, and never loudly, the kind that whispers, "You've come home." She reached for my hand, and I gave it freely. I don't know what to call you now, she said, teasing. Call me whatever feels like love, I said. And she did.